Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service on this Friday, May 5th, 2023. And if you'd like additional weather information on top of what I provide during this broadcast, you can go to weather.gov. That is the National Weather Service's online presence that brings you to a map of the continental U.S. with Alaska, Hawaii in the lower left. Also, you can get data for the American Samoa, as well as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. On the weather map this afternoon, here in the lower 48, we have a severe thunderstorm watch in through central Texas for scattered severe thunderstorms capable of producing some damaging winds and large hail. We have red flag warnings for critical fire weather conditions due to dry conditions, warm temperatures, strong winds. Southeast Colorado, much of New Mexico, and then further north and west, these areas of green indicate flood potential outlooks, and the darker green flood watches for snowmelt flooding for areas of the central northern Rockies on up through parts of Idaho and Washington State. Well, earlier this morning, the full flower moon of May occurred, so if you have clear to partly cloudy skies this evening, late evening, you'll be able to see that moon. The coldest air remains out over the Chukchi Sea and up along the northwest Arctic coast, where temperatures have remained in the 20s. Lingering areas of light snow or mixed rain and snow showers will continue over portions of the interior. They've been mainly over the southwest and west central interior this Friday, but that area will move slowly eastward a bit. And the good news is we're going to see a gradual warming trend to our temperatures next week and into the following week as we head into the middle part of May. But still, some lingering snow, light fog up there around Ambler this afternoon, 35 degrees. Further east along the Alcan border, bright blue sky. Eagle, it's been sunny and mild with temperatures in the mid-50s for highs. It even hit 50 degrees in Fairbanks, and we've had some temperatures near 50 in Anchorage, as well as areas of the lower Susitna Valley, including Palmer. One other thing I want to mention is that we are approaching river breakup season, so be prepared. At this time, we've had a gradual, the colder weather has kept the snow and ice from really breaking up, melting off, but still it's important to stay proactive and be prepared. Make sure you move and safeguard your property before high water occurs with the breakup. Have extra food, batteries, and medical supplies ready in case you get cut off for some reason, and then know your community safety plan and emergency shelter locations, and then always stay out of floodwaters and ice flows, as that can be quite dangerous. But looking at the satellite imagery this afternoon, there is a weak low pressure here to the southeast of Kodiak Island. There's a couple lows down here in the North Pacific. A ridge of high pressure extends up through the central Aleutians, right up along through the northern part of the state, along to areas of the Canadian Arctic coast. And a pretty good shot of moisture working its way up here through western Canada, up to the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and some enhanced rain and snow. The bulk of that, though, will stay east of the Alcan border. And here is that low this afternoon, weak one southeast of Kodiak Island, with the trough that extends up into the west central interior. That feature continues to hold through tonight with scattered snow showers or areas of light snow. And during the day on Saturday, we anticipate some of that to spread a little further east, where there could be some scattered light rain and snow showers mixed here up along the middle upper Yukon Valley and along the Alaska Range, as well as areas up toward the Arctic and Canadian Arctic coast. Next frontal system working its way into the western, in through the central Aleutians on Saturday afternoon, a low way back toward Kamchatka, and that will be pushing eastward on Sunday. The occluded front will work its way east through the eastern Aleutians with breezy conditions and rain. Further north, there'll be a band of snow associated with that, and then weak high pressure over the Seward Peninsula Sunday afternoon. But we're still going to see some scattered light rain and snow showers possible, especially along and south of the Alaska Range, extending into western Columbia, British Columbia areas here for the latter weekend. Eventually, that same frontal system will push more precipitation up into the Panhandle by the latter half of next week. But in the meantime, lows generally in the 30s to near 40 degrees in the Panhandle. Could still dip down below freezing, upper Susitna, Copper River Basin, but we anticipate lows to stay above freezing across much of the Kenai. And in the Anchorage Bowl, temperatures Saturday afternoon will be back up in the upper 40s to near 50 degrees. Could pop out 50 there at Talkeetna. Temperatures into the 50s across the Panhandle, and then Sunday morning lows again, coldest Copper River Basin back down below freezing into the 20s. Elsewhere, most areas along the coast, south central just inland a bit, and the Panhandle above freezing, with temperatures back up into the 50s across the Panhandle, inner and outer channels, and then for areas of around Cook Inlet, we're looking at 50 degrees, Soldotna on up toward Anchorage, 53 perhaps up there at Talkeetna. Coldest air continues to be here along the Arctic coast. It's situated up here over the Chukchi Sea, and it's lifting northeastward. Temperatures will be near freezing for lows along and south of the Yukon River. Temperatures on Saturday afternoon still back up around 50 at Fairbanks, Yukon Flats, a bit warmer than that, lower mid-50s in places like Eagle, Northway. Further to the west side of the Seward Peninsula, Wales, Teller still in the 20s. Lows Sunday morning could dip down back into the teens in some spots around Kotzebue Sound and up there toward, say, Wainwright. And so it's still going to stay cool here along the northwestern coast. Interior areas, maybe not quite as warm with some cloud cover Sunday afternoon, some scattered light rain and snow showers, generally in the 40s to near 50 degrees. Interior, southwest, we expect temperatures back down below freezing. Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, only upper 30s to near 40 degrees. McGrath, maybe 46. Otherwise, even along the Aleutians, upper 30s and lower 40s, generally the rule. Sunday morning, temperatures back down into the 20s below freezing here across much of the lower Yukon and lower middle Kuskokwim River Basin. And Sunday afternoon, we should get temperatures maybe a little warmer, finally getting readings back up above 40 in a number of spots, and perhaps as warm as 45 there at Bethel and on over toward King Salmon. Now, looking at the 6 to 10 day temperature outlook, good news is as we go into next week and the following week, temperatures are going to gradually warm. We're not looking at a sudden warm up, which would not be good news for that might precipitate a really rapid breakup, a dynamic breakup of the rivers. Right now, we're thinking, at least by and large, this gradual warm up will be good news for reducing the potential of that happening. We anticipate near normal temperatures, especially Anchorage on up through the interior. Above normal temperatures up in the northeast there, Yukon Flats, Arctic Village up toward Kaktovik, and parts of the Panhandle. Still cooler than normal, especially along the southwestern parts of the state, the YK deltas into Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula. And then precipitation-wise, precipitation should generally average near normal across most of the mainland, except for areas surrounding Cook Inlet, and especially more likely around Prince William Sound, the northeastern Gulf, into the northern parts of the Panhandle, though we're not anticipating any really heavy dumps of precipitation. Still looks like, though, as I mentioned, things are on track for at least a gradual warming trend here the next couple of weeks, which would allow temperatures to return back up to around or a bit above normal.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Well, it's now time for your aviation weather. If you have a flight planned this weekend, Saturday or on Sunday, we're going to see areas of IFR conditions persist in portions of the mainland along the Alcan border, 40-mile Gold Country, also down through areas of the western Alaska Range into the western interior, some scattered snow showers, lower ceilings, just along and off of the Arctic coast back towards St. Lawrence, St. Matthew, and then way out toward the western Aleutians, associated with a low pressure and frontal system that will be working its way eastward through the course of the weekend. Saturday afternoon, rather broad areas of MVFR expected along and northwest of the Alaska Range, as well as the Brooks Range and North Slope, with IFR up there along the eastern Arctic coast and the east end of the Brooks Range. And then you can see the IFR conditions through the lower bearing associated with that frontal system working its way east. By Sunday morning, push of moisture is also going to generate area of IFR conditions over the western western Gulf, up through areas of the Kenai, Cook Inlet, on up toward the western lower end of the Alaska Range. Also rather extensive IFR conditions, lower Bering just north of the western half of the Aleutians and up along areas of the Arctic coast. And finally, Sunday afternoon, broad MVFR conditions out over the Gulf up into Prince William Sound, also along the North Slope Arctic coast through the Bering Strait, but then a more extensive area of IFR conditions associated with low pressure out in the lower Bering Sea with a front that extends eastward. It'll be pushing through the eastern Aleutians and then on up into the Alaska Peninsula come Monday. And for past conditions on Saturday, we're looking at Anaktuvuk VFR becoming MVFR. Same thing at Adigan Pass there up in the Brooks Range. VFR conditions becoming MVFR. Further south and west along the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill, some IFR conditions, especially along the west entrances in the morning, giving way to MVFR conditions. Rainy Pass, generally MVFR conditions are expected. Also at Windy Pass in the central Alaska Range. Isabel will start out MVFR becoming VFR on Saturday, and also Mentasta Pass MVFR in the morning becoming VFR. Further south and west, Tanita Pass should generally hold on to MVFR conditions. Portage Pass will see VFR conditions in the morning, giving way to MVFR conditions by midday and afternoon. And then finally, out through the north end of the Panhandle at Chilkoot and White, MVFR conditions in the morning, giving way to VFR conditions. We have a broad area of high pressure, a warm dome of air up over north central Canada. We have freezing levels that are above 10,000 feet out through these areas, so very warm air mass. That falls off. We have freezing levels aloft over Alaska, generally above 2,000 feet through the middle upper Yukon Valley, 4,000 feet as you get up through the upper Yukon Valley. Surface freezing line Saturday morning runs out through the northern Bering, dipping down to just east of St. Paul and then back in through Bristol Bay and up then just north of the Yukon River toward the Alcan border. Greatest threat of some icing, there could be some isolated moderate icing out over areas of the western interior along and north of the Alaska Range, mainly associated with some scattered snow showers or mixed rain and snow showers as we go through the day. Interesting little feature is going to be producing icing areas out over western Canada. This disturbance is going to work its way off toward the north and northeast and then out over the Bering Sea, 2,000 to 4,000 feet aloft once you get above those levels associated with that low pressure and frontal system. On the upper level map at 30,000 feet jet stream level, high pressure centered there way up over central Canada, and it's this circulation on the backside of it, 110 knot jet along the Alcan border. As we go into Saturday, dropping down to 700 millibars, wind flow relatively light over the mainland and Panhandle. Back out to the west, though, we have a belt of stronger winds associated with the low that's way out here toward the western Bering, and as we come down to 3,000 feet, you can see that low there in the western Bering, a core of stronger lower level winds around 3,000 feet that are still, though, south-southwest of the central Aleutians with winds upwards of, say, 50 to 75 knots. Broad belt of winds southwest to south at 40 knots from areas of the central Aleutians up and through the lower Bering Sea. And this is going to translate to an area of turbulence, the mainland and much of the Panhandle, not a whole lot going on, but here we do expect some considerable moderate turbulence from areas of the Alaska Peninsula on the North Pacific side, and then especially across the central Aleutians, generally from the surface to about 4,000 feet during the day on Saturday.
Welcome to this edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Carrie Haisley, Chief of the Emergency Services and Multimedia Branch for the National Weather Service in Anchorage. With me today, I have Dr. Doug Wesley, a physical scientist for the National Weather Service Alaska Region Headquarters. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Carrie. Hello.
Hello. So you're here to talk to us a little bit about something called CocoRAS, which is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And I understand that CocoRAS is a network of volunteers who take weather observations. Can you tell us a little bit more about what CocoRAS is?
Yes, it began in the lower 48, 20 some years ago, and it's expanded during those 2 decades. They're getting something like 10 to 15,000 rainfall reports per day from the lower 48.
Wow, that's a lot of different reports. So how many reports do we get in Alaska right now?
Well, it varies. Maybe 10 to 25. But if you consider the large areas we're talking about, we have a lot of gaps to fill. Any observation is better than no observation, but there are large areas in Alaska. Alaska covers 3 million square miles. There's a lot of data gaps in that space, so we'd like to enhance it.
Sure. So tell us then a bit about why these observations are so important to Alaska and why we need to expand the number of them that we're getting.
Yes, Alaska, as you know, has large areas with a lot of complex terrain, and there are no weather observing stations or radar. So CoCoRaHS can help fill the data gaps, so you can at least get some idea of what's actually falling from the sky at those locations. CoCoRaHS increases the amount of timely weather observations available to meteorologists and other decision makers, especially in hazardous type of weather, both rain and snow and the occasional hailstorm that we get up here. CoCoRaHS observations can help forecasters identify long-term precipitation and snowfall trends in a climate sense. And just overall, they increase the amount of timely weather observations available to the public.
So then let's talk a little bit about each of the different types of observations. So it's the rain, hail, and snow network. So let's start by talking a little bit about rain observations and tell us a little bit about how you take those and how long it takes a volunteer to get a rain observation.
Okay, this is a 4-inch gauge, just the basic gauge, which you use for both rain and snowfall. But the rain observations are pretty quick. It's a matter of 2 to 3 minutes that each volunteer goes out and takes a reading, and then they enter these on the computer, and they're immediately available for observation on the computer and on the maps, so that you can see your report. In the wintertime, it's a little bit more complicated. We require the observers to measure not only the snow accumulation, but also liquid equivalent. So they've got to melt the snowfall. This involves 2 of these gauges and a snowboard. And it's maybe a 10-minute observation per day during the winter. But the snowfall is so variable that even across town and in especially the remote areas, it's crucial that we increase this number of snow observations in the network.
Right. I understand that we can only take observations in places where we have weather service offices, and so we rely on all of these volunteers to help us fill gaps. And it's also interesting to know how snowfall varies across large spaces or even small cities. So I noticed here in Anchorage, for example, we can have a vastly different amount of snow on the east side of town and the west side of town. And so it seems like these observations would help us to better understand what's going on in places besides just where the office is.
That's correct. In any given snowfall, there are typically large variances, as you know, and we rely on reports from the public and from National Weather Service cooperative spotters to map out the snowfall that occurs so that we can predict it better in the future.
Sure. So we talked about rain observations and we talked about snow observations. And you said for each of those, if it's rain, it only takes a couple minutes, and then it can take about 10 minutes if it's snow. Hail was the other one that we didn't talk about yet. Tell us just a little bit about the hail observations that CoCoRaHS observers take.
Yeah, the CoCoRaHS network, it has a hail pad, and it's just a simple block of styrofoam covered with aluminum foil, and you can approximate the size of hail by measuring the dent that the hail causes on the pad, and this can give us an estimate of hail size. We don't get hail very often in Alaska, but I've seen it 2 or 3 times in my 5 years in Anchorage, and some of it up to a ½ inch, and I'm sure there's been larger hail up in the interior at times.
So let's talk a little bit about how these rain, hail, and snow observations can help forecasters. So we have people who forecast the weather, and we also have people who work on the hydrology side, and I can see that maybe CoCoRaHS will be beneficial to both of them. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, it's beneficial to the hydrologic forecaster who's concern about flooding, and rainfall comprises one of the causes of a flood, or it can exacerbate high water conditions. So the more the hydrologist has to look at in terms of data from recent rainfall, the more information they have to work with when they're generating a forecast. The weather forecasters in the wintertime at the Weather Service office can use these observations also to help with past case studies, to verify model data, and to get a handle on what's actually happening out the window. And that's important in the forecast process.
Yeah, it seems like you can never have too much information when you're issuing a forecast. So it only takes a few minutes most of the time to take these observations. So let's say I'm interested in becoming a volunteer for CocoRa's. How do I get involved?
Yeah, the website is very useful, cocoras.org, and it has a number of video-based training tutorials that take you right on from measuring rainfall to a video tutorial on measuring snowfall. It has the maps available in real time, and you can go back and look at that old data too through those maps. And so it's a very useful, comprehensive website.
Very interesting. And anybody can get involved, right? You don't have to be a meteorologist.
That's right. And, we love to have 24, once a day reports throughout the year, but if you can't, then so be it. And we have observers, some observers are out of town for periods of time, or maybe they can only report, a week or two of precipitation, but it's still useful. It's still data that we look at. So the more the better, but you can get involved even if you aren't at a location 24/7.
Doug, I really appreciate you coming on to our program today to talk about CocoRa's. Hopefully we can have you back in the studio at some point so we can talk more about it and then talk more about the different types of observations and the tools that observers use.
That would be great, yeah.
So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for joining this edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back, and it's now time to look at our marine weather segment, and this includes the sea ice edge, areas along the far north Arctic coast. Generally, the ice still well in place across the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas. The coldest pocket of air right now is residing here over this region of the Chukchi Sea, but it will be lifting northeastward as we go into the early weekend. There are a few polynyas that opened up between Utqiagvik and Point Lay. We see more in the way of some opening water and melt-off occurring south of the Bering Strait, surrounding areas of St. Lawrence Island and within Norton Sound. Further south of there, the ice is also shrinking in coverage and melting off, despite the fact temperatures have averaged below normal across this region for the past several weeks. But we are at that point in the season with the high sun angle that the inevitable, this trend will just continue here as we go through the month of May, with the ice melting off and retreating farther north. Your marine forecast for the Panhandle, for the inner channels, winds will be kind of a mixed bag direction-wise at about 10 knots, waves 2 to 3 feet. For the outer coast, within 15 nautical miles of shore, west to northwest winds 10 to 15 knots, waves 5 to 6 feet on Saturday. For Sunday, we expect southeast to south winds 10 knots for the inner channels, with waves a couple of feet. For the outer coast, winds will be west-northwest again at 10 to 15 knots, with waves of 4 to maybe 5 feet. Further west, surrounding Cook Inlet and here the northwestern Gulf, winds generally southeasterly here in through Prince William Sound, 10 knots, waves a couple of feet. Variable winds 10 knots up there along the north third of Cook Inlet, and then southeast winds coming into the entrance there of Cook Inlet at 15 knots with waves of 3 feet. On Sunday, winds generally variable across the region around 10 knots, 2-foot waves within Prince William Sound, 2-foot waves generally along the length of Cook Inlet, maybe 3 feet there at the entrance and northeast of Cook Kodiak. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, winds southwest 20 knots across Kodiak Island, 3 to 4 foot waves there, including Shelikof Strait. Areas across the Alaska Peninsula, generally northwest winds 15 to 20 knots, waves 2 to 3 feet on the North Pacific side and 3 to 4 feet on the Bering side. On Sunday, we are going to have an occluded front approaching from the southwest, so that's going to turn winds southwesterly 15 knots around Kodiak Island. They're going to crank around to the southeast at about 30 knots, with waves building 8 to 9 feet on the North Pacific side and about 4 feet on the Bering side. For the Aleutians, winds still northwest on far eastern Aleutians around 15 knots at Unalaska. And then as we go further west, central Aleutians, look for south winds picking up 20 to as high as 25, 30 knots there between Adak and Atka. And then on Sunday, as that front works its way east, there will be some gale force winds upwards of 35 knots across the eastern Aleutians. Those winds will be up out of the south-southwest. And waves on the North Pacific side will generally be 10 to 13 feet. On the Bering side, 6 to 9 feet. And then along the southwest coast, variable winds at St. Matthew, St. Paul, and St. George at 10 knots, waves running 2-3 feet there. Along the lower Yukon Delta, winds will be out of the west at 10 to 15 knots, waves a couple of feet where you do have some open water. And then on Sunday, we anticipate with that front just off to the southwest, approaching St. Paul and St. George, 40-knot gale force winds out of the southeast and east up to St. Matthew there, with waves running 12 to 14 feet. Gale force winds southeast to east, 35 knots there within Bristol and Kuskokwim bays, but generally out of the east at 10 knots there across the lower Yukon Delta, with waves of 2 feet. Along the Arctic coast, winds will be out of the east 15 to 25 knots, Prudhoe Bay on over toward Kaptovik. Continuing out of the east, we see winds drop off to about 10 knots and then turning northwesterly through the lower Chukchi Sea, 10 to 15 knots, especially south there of Cape Lisburne and Point Hope, with ice still in place and a mixed bag north to westerly winds there once you get south of the Bering Strait at about 10 to 15 knots. And then finally, Sunday, winds come down 10 to 15 knots out of the west there along the central and eastern Arctic coast. Kind of a variable, maybe offshore 5-knot wind at Utqiagvik. South winds lower Chukchi Sea and the Bering Strait, 10 to 15 knots, with ice still in place there, but where you do have some open water, waves may be a couple of feet within open water there, Norton Sound and west of Seward Peninsula. So Saturday, here comes that occluded front out there in through the central Aleutians, with the low way out toward the Kamchatka coast. That low will move into the south central Bering, with the front working its way east.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.